We've got our last speaker, Neil Francis. Thank you very much, Jane, for that presentation. Neil is the Foundation Chairman and CEO of Your Last Right, the National Alliance of State and Territory Dying with Dignity and Voluntary Euthanasia Societies. He's also President and CEO of Dying with Dignity Victoria. He's a medical scientist and has a career spanning primary medical research, information technology, communications and postgraduate education. He's across the latest thinking and literature on aid in dying, including values and faith, medical practice, palliative care and terminal sedation, mental health and dementias, and outcomes in jurisdictions where aid in dying is legal. And that's what he's going to talk to us about today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's a great pleasure to escape the Melbourne weather, at least for a day. I'm going to perhaps come around full circle to what's been alluded to by certainly Kate and Marshall in their early addresses, and that is what is going to happen when legislation is introduced into the New South Wales Parliament. And what's going to happen is a lot of FUD. So let's talk about a lot of FUD. And by that I mean fear, uncertainty and doubt generated by those who are philosophically opposed to rational adult Australians having a choice. And why can we make that assertion? Because it's happened in every single jurisdiction in the world that has ever introduced legislative reform. So what I'll do is I'll give you 3 examples of FUD that are quite common. They occur here in Australia. I will share with you an admission about the FUD that was made by an opponent, and then we'll hear briefly from sources from Belgium and Oregon who indicate that the law in their jurisdictions works entirely well. Thank you. So let's move on to the first one. Paul Russell, who is Australia's most active anti-voluntary euthanasia campaigner, wrote this on the 2nd of April this year. I often use as an example of the death of a 26-year-old ballerina in Holland. She contracted a form of arthritis at this young age and her dancing career and dreams were dashed. An American oncologist who spoke later to the killing doctor reported the Dutch medico as saying something like, "One doesn't like doing it, but it was her choice." We can only but wonder at the degradation of ethics that would allow a trained healer to kill in such circumstances. Now, John Moxon, who is a respected disability campaigner here in Sydney, he appeared on ABC's Q&A recently, in recent weeks, and made this same assertion. So let's have a look at where this actually comes from. Now I'm going to have to do a little sleight of hand here because the videos don't play within the slides.
One of the people that does euthanasia over there a couple of years ago euthanized a 26-year-old ballerina because she had arthritis in her toes and she didn't want to live anymore. His comment was, one doesn't enjoy this sort of thing, but it's her choice.
So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the source of that remark. That is the American oncologist. That is Dr. Robin Bernhoft. He is the author of The Glory of God, Is Man Fully Alive? He is entitled to his point of view. I will be the first to argue that. I would also like you to know that he has described those who support the theory of evolution as atheists, the sexually immoral, abortion supporters, social Darwinists, racists and violators of each of the commandments. He's entitled to his point of view. However, he is not entitled, in my view, to create a great, big, fat, hairy myth. I have checked with all our sources in the Netherlands. No one has ever heard of such a case. and if he believes it is true, produce documentary, verifiable evidence to inform the debate. The next one, Paul Russell once again, wrote this on the 29th of July this year. In Oregon, following the introduction of doctor-assisted suicide, suicide by other methods went up and not down as predicted. This is consistent with suicide contagion or clusters. So here we have a slippery slope of contagion and clusters. Well, I thought that was a pretty important thing to understand about how Oregon's law might or might not be working. So let's have a look at the actual statistics published by the Oregon government. And here they are. We won't go into them into too much detail, but from 1981 at the left here to 2009, the most recent year in which this data is available, here is the year in which the Death with Dignity Act was introduced. Here's the rate of suicide prior, here is the rate after the legislation was introduced. It has dropped slightly. And ladies and gentlemen, for anyone who's statistically inclined, P equals 0.02, which in layman's language means it's highly statistically significant, that little drop. It hasn't gone through the roof, it has not soared. That allegation is utterly false. So let's move on to the third example, which is one of the most common of all, and that is that the rate of non-voluntary euthanasia in Belgium and the Netherlands is an absolute disaster and is a consequence of them legalising euthanasia. Let me just explain what I mean by non-voluntary euthanasia. Voluntary euthanasia is where the patient makes the choice. Non-voluntary euthanasia is where the patient does not have the capacity to make the choice. And so, for example, this might be a comatose patient in intensive care with serious organ failure right at the end of life. Some examples. The Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne on their website still have a statement saying that 1,000 Dutch euthanasia deaths a year occur without current explicit request. That's non-voluntary euthanasia. The New South Wales Right to Life website, until recently, curiously, they've recently withdrawn their statement, but it said 500 deaths a year. So did Margaret Somerville in her anti-euthanasia tour of Australia recently. So what's this 1,500? Who's right? Further, Betty Roberts, writing on behalf of the Catholic Women's League in 2009, remember that year, 2009, in Tasmania, said this: Australia could become like Belgium, where even before euthanasia became legal in 2001, 3.3% of all deaths are non-voluntary euthanasia. So, just hold that thought. Here's the data, ladies and gentlemen. I just want you to focus on the blue for a moment. Ignore the green, the blue. The blue is the Dutch data. Here is the rate published back in 1995, the rate of non-voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands. The data was actually collected in 1991, but it was published in 95. That, come on, pointer, sorry. This bar is 1,000 deaths a year. This bar is 500 deaths a year. They're both right. What didn't they do? Join the dots. What they omitted to tell you was that it actually went down. What happened in the middle? The Netherlands enacted a euthanasia law. And the same thing in Belgium. Here is the rate of non-voluntary euthanasia in Belgium published in this year. These are scientific studies. This is the rate published in 2007. What happened in between? Belgium enacted a euthanasia law. The rate went down, and it went down very significantly. Now, if you remember, I said Betty wrote in 2009, which is here on the graph, that the rate was 3.3%. That, ladies and gentlemen, is this bar. That data was already available, and it was not in her report. The other premise that comes out of this investigation is it assumes that no such thing ever happens here in Australia. Well, that too is wrong. The red bar is the rate of non-voluntary euthanasia as it occurs in Australia, the only time it's ever been measured. And I think you'll agree we don't have anything to crow about. So, There is a large and inventive repertoire of myths and misrepresentations which the evidence contradicts. So what's this admission? In 2008, I spent a week in Oregon with the Honourable Ken Smith, who was now the Speaker of the Victorian Parliament, and we researched how their death with dignity law worked in that country. And we met with all sorts of folks. One of them was Dr. Bill Toffler, who is quite a vehement opponent, which is absolutely his right. But I was very interested when we met with him that he said this. Oops.
Now what we're saying is, it exists, the slippery slope. And can we prove cause and effect? Of course not.
Straight out of his own mouth. We're saying it exists, the slippery slope. Can we prove cause and effect? That is, does law reform lead to abuse? Does it lead to the slippery slope? No, we can't prove that. Of course not. So the most vehement opponent in the jurisdiction in the world that has the longest existing voluntary euthanasia law or assisted dying law acknowledges that the data doesn't support their argument. So, let's have a look at Belgium. In Belgium, I interviewed the senior people in palliative care Flanders, and so this is a short interview, recording of an interview with those good folks.
I'm the president of the Federation of Palliative Care in Flanders, and about 2 years ago we voted with the Federation, with the board, a text which says that there should be no two rails on the end, two tracks on the end of life, a track of palliative care and a track of euthanasia, that it should be one track, and that we call this track integral palliative care. The experience learns that there is a synergy even between palliative care and euthanasia care, There is a synergy in the sense that you have better palliative care if you have some openness towards euthanasia, and you have better euthanasia if palliative care is also involved.
It's very important to listen to the patient and to respect what he wants, but everything starts with really listening to what the patient wants, and to support him in finding out what he wants, whether that be palliative care, another treatment, or euthanasia.
As a federation, we took the point that you have to care for every patient, also for the patient who asks euthanasia, and that euthanasia is not something awful. In the idea of some opposite opponents, they think euthanasia is something inhuman. That it's on the opposite, it can be very beautiful, it can be a very good form of dying on the condition that you are very careful.
Clinical experience of my own, and I hear from many colleagues similar experiences, is that when a patient asks two things, when quite a number of more and more patients ask for euthanasia, then the resistance is very often from the family, right, who really do not want to part rapidly.
that Catholic Church and theology in general is not very fond of euthanasia, and that can be a personal conviction of somebody working in palliative care, whether he is medical doctor or psychologist or spiritual caregiver. The point is, can we listen to the patient and listen what the request of the patient is? I think it's important that from that point of view we listen and respect the autonomy of the patient. Paternalism is very bad.
In the beginning, there were, in the palliative care movement, some who were very resistant because they say we want to have the pure Cicely Saunders care package, so to say, palliative care, and we don't want to the slippery slope, also not in our professional attitudes. But the fact is that almost 10 years later, those teams who have this openness do not have a feeling that they are on a slippery slope.
We should be all aware that there are many, many more requests than actually are carried out. And the reason, and that's more and more so, the reason, most important reason that I can see is that many patients are quite satisfied with the idea, or reassured with the idea that if and when the time comes, when they express that wish, they will be, it will be honored, so that peace and serenity is promoted.
So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the view of professionals in a jurisdiction that has such a law already. I'll just conclude with a couple of recent voices from Oregon, two that we interviewed. Anne Jackson, who was, she's now retired, but she was at the time we spoke with her about 20 years, the CEO of the Oregon Hospice Association, and she said in quite simple language, the sky didn't fall. We also spoke with Senator Ginny Burdick of the Oregon Legislature, and she said the law has worked beautifully. The scare stories were just that, scare stories based on nothing. None of the terrible things that opponents predicted has ever come to pass. So we welcome a debate about this issue. We welcome a bill in the New South Wales Parliament, but we do believe that it's inappropriate to deny the people of New South Wales a reform they want through misinformation, innuendo and FUD. And I want to hereby put FUDders on notice that if you do so, we will out you. We will speak up, we will identify those misinformation, that misinformation that is put forward and correct the record. So we will support the New South Wales bill to our utmost. Thank you.